Welcome to What Does the Bible Teach? With Pastor Joshua Olivares. I'm Jamie, and in today's episode, we will be finishing off our discussion of Matthew chapter 24 with What does the parable of the fig tree mean? And why is the hour and time of his coming not revealed in verse 36? Also, why does Jesus compare his coming to the days of Noah and the flood? And lastly, what lesson does the parable of the faithful and evil servant teach us? So, Pastor Josh, what does the Bible teach?
Thank you, Jamie. As we finish off Matthew chapter 24, the Bible teaches us here in verse 42, "Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will." Now here in verse 43, beloved, the Lord compares his return to that of a thief who unexpectedly comes to steal. However, the comparison is not so much about the thief's morality, but rather the sudden timing and unawareness of his coming. Because in verse 42 down to verse 44, it talks about the unexpectancy and suddenness of his coming. And because the Lord does compare his unexpected and sudden return to that of a thief who comes at a time and hour where the owner is unaware. And according to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, starting at verse 2, "For you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord will come, just like a thief in the night." Then in 2 Peter chapter 3, starting at verse 10, "But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, in which the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the elements will be destroyed with intense heat, and the earth and its works will be burned up." And not only does Matthew chapter 24, verses 42 to 44 talk about the suddenness and unexpectancy of Christ's return at his second advent, but as well it teaches us as believers that we ought to always be ready, always expecting, and never to be ignorant nor foolish. Because in Matthew 24, verse 38, the Bible teaches us, "For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark," which means they went about their normal lives not expecting anything. Then verse 39 says, "And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be." Then we also see in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, starting at verse 3, "While they are saying peace and safety, then destruction will come upon them, suddenly like labor pains upon a woman with child, and they will not escape. But you, brethren, are not in darkness, that the day would overtake you like a thief. For you are all sons of light and sons of day. We are not of night nor of darkness. So then, let us not sleep as others do, but let us be alert and sober." Now coming back to Matthew chapter 24, starting at verse 44, "For this reason, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will." Now, the title Son of Man is used 4 times in this chapter alone, and it is seen in verses 30, verse 37, verse 39, and verse 44. And this messianic title is actually found in the book of Daniel, chapter 7, verse 13 and 14, and the context speaks of a divine deliverer, a mighty ruler and king, that is going to build a kingdom that will never be destroyed. And in Daniel chapter 7, starting at verse 13, the Bible teaches us, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. So when Christ uses this title of himself, he is pretty much saying in this chapter of Matthew 24 that at his return, he will rescue, deliver, judge, and establish his millennial kingdom. And according to Zechariah chapter 14, starting at verse 9, the Bible teaches us, "And the Lord will be king over all the earth. In that day, the Lord will be the only one, and his name the only one." Then in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, starting at verse 25, "For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet." Now, moving on to answer the question that was asked earlier concerning about what does the parable of the faithful and evil servant teach us, we must read Matthew chapter 24, for this parable is found in verses 45. "Who then is the faithful and sensible slave, whom his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave, whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that evil slave says in his heart, 'My master is not coming for a long time,' and begins to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour which he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Now the lesson here speaks of a faithful servant who remains faithful to his master despite his master's absence and continues to occupy faithfully till his master returns. And this is quite similar to what we see in the book of Luke, chapter 19, verse 13. "And he called his 10 servants and delivered them 10 pounds and said unto them, Occupy till I come." While on the contrary, the evil servant has no regards, nor takes into value or of great importance the promise of the master's return, which eventually is going to lead to severe consequences. Because according to 2 Peter chapter 3, starting at verse 3, "Know this first of all, that in the last days mockers will come with their mocking, following after their own lusts, and saying, Where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning of creation. For when they maintain this, it escapes their notice that by the word of God the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and by water, through which the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded with water. But by his word, the present heavens and earth are being reserved for fire, kept for the day of judgment and destruction of ungodly men." So the point that we see from verses 42 down to verse 51 of Matthew 24, that Christ, after the tribulation period, will come back at his second advent, at his second coming, on a day and hour where it is unexpected, it is sudden, and where many will be unaware of his return. And therefore, as believers, we ought to be ready, for we know not the hour, the time, and day of the Lord's return. And that is why in our study of Matthew chapter 24, I pray and hope that we have come to the understanding and the context of this great chapter, And if you have any questions concerning about today's episode or questions about the Bible in general, kindly let us know, and we will do what we can to answer your questions on this podcast, What Does the Bible Teach? This is Pastor Joshua Olivares, just wanting to gladly remind you that Jesus Christ is God.